It began as a question no one dared to explore. What truly happens after burial? The topic had lingered in the shadows of human curiosity for centuries, dismissed as taboo or left unanswered due to fear and superstition. But one team of scientists, led by the ambitious and unrelenting Dr. Eleanor Carter, decided to confront the unknown. They weren't just scientists, they were trailblazers, determined to shed light on humanity's oldest mystery. The team's idea was radical yet simple: to install a state-of-the-art invisible camera inside a coffin. The goal wasn't to provoke fear or disrupt traditions, but to gather objective evidence about a subject steeped in speculation. Was it about science, pure curiosity, or perhaps the desire to challenge what humanity had accepted for generations? Dr. Carter, in her usual calm yet commanding demeanor, justified their mission. It's not about meddling with beliefs. It's about understanding the reality we've been too afraid to face. The project wasn't without its obstacles. Religious leaders condemned it as disrespectful, and ethical committees raised red flags, accusing the team of crossing moral boundaries. Even within the team, doubts crept in. Despite the backlash, Dr. Carter remained steadfast. She believed they stood on the brink of a discovery that could redefine humanity's perspective on life and death. Months of meticulous planning followed. The team eventually found a volunteer, a man named Robert Langston. At 78 years old, Robert was a retired firefighter whose life had been filled with acts of bravery. Diagnosed with a terminal illness, he had made peace with his fate. When approached with the experiment, Robert didn't hesitate. "If my last moments can contribute to something greater, then I'm ready," he said, with a resolve that moved the entire team. On the day of the burial, as the coffin was prepared and the equipment finalized, the weight of their endeavor became undeniable. Robert's family, though initially reluctant, stood by his decision, their eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and pride. For the scientists, it wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was a journey into the unknown, with Robert Langston leading the way. The burial day arrived under a blanket of heavy clouds, setting a somber tone. Robert Langston's family gathered at the cemetery, their expressions a mix of grief and quiet admiration. His wife, Sarah, stood at the forefront, clutching a handkerchief and holding back tears, while his two children, Mark and Linda, stood close by, their faces etched with sadness. They had come to terms with Robert's decision, but couldn't shake the unease that came with knowing their loved one was part of an unprecedented experiment. The funeral proceeded with respect and dignity. As the coffin, equipped with the tiny invisible camera, was lowered into the ground, the scientists observed from a discreet distance. The camera, installed with precision, had been thoroughly tested to transmit clear, uninterrupted footage from within the confined space. Everything seemed ordinary, almost peaceful, until the first shovel of soil hit the coffin lid, echoing faintly through the live feed. Back at the lab, Dr. Carter and her team gathered around the monitors. The camera feed displayed the coffin's interior in sharp detail, bathed in the green glow of the night vision filter. For the first hour, there was nothing unusual, just silence. The faint hum of the equipment and the occasional creak of the wooden coffin were the only sounds. The scientists, though tense, began to settle into the monotony of waiting. However, at the 2-hour mark, something shifted. A soft noise, like a faint tap, interrupted the stillness. The team froze, their eyes locked on the screen. The sound came again, rhythmic and deliberate, as though something or someone was tapping from within. Dr. Carter frowned, her fingers tightening around her notepad. "Is this interference?" one technician asked nervously, but the tone in their voice betrayed a growing sense of dread. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an even softer sound, a subtle scraping as if fabric was brushing against wood. The lab fell silent, every ear tuned to the faint noises transmitted from 6 feet below. Though the coffin's interior appeared still on the screen, the sounds carried an unsettling intentionality. Dr. Carter leaned closer to the monitor, her voice steady but tinged with tension. "Record everything. This isn't random." Hours passed and the noises continued sporadically. The team debated their origin, attempting to rationalize the inexplicable. But as the night wore on, a feeling of unease began to settle over them. Something about the rhythm of the sounds felt too calculated, too deliberate. It wasn't what they had expected, and it wasn't something they could explain. As the clock struck the 8th hour, the faint sounds grew more pronounced and tension in the lab became palpable. The scraping evolved into a repetitive, almost methodical noise, like fingers brushing or pressing against the wooden coffin lid. Dr. Carter sat upright, her eyes glued to the screen. The other scientists exchanged uneasy glances, whispering theories that ranged from equipment malfunctions to atmospheric pressure causing shifts within the coffin. But then, something happened that silenced the room entirely. The camera feed flickered for a brief second, and when it stabilized, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement caught their attention. The edge of Robert's burial shroud appeared to shift slightly, as if tugged by an unseen force. A collective gasp rippled through the room as the team scrambled to rewind the footage. It could be a draft, one scientist suggested, though the explanation lacked conviction. The coffin was sealed. There were no drafts, no external factors. Dr. Carter, calm but visibly affected, played the footage on repeat. "It's not a coincidence," she said firmly. "Something is causing this." The movement ceased for a while, but the oppressive silence that followed was even more unnerving. The scientists began to feel the weight of their decision pressing down on them. For all their preparation, they were unprepared for what came next. At precisely the 12th hour, the audio feed picked up a new sound. It wasn't a tap or a scrape this time. It was faint, almost like a whisper. The voice, if it could be called that, was indistinct, but it carried a cadence that sent chills through the lab. Dr. Carter motioned for the sound to be amplified, and the technicians complied, their hands trembling. The whispers grew clearer, though they still couldn't make out distinct words. What are we hearing?" one of the technicians asked, their voice barely audible. Dr. Carter didn't respond immediately. She leaned closer to the monitor, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's like a vocalization," she said finally, her voice steady but heavy with uncertainty. "But it doesn't sound like him. It doesn't sound human." The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving an eerie quiet that hung thick in the air. The team sat frozen, the reality of their experiment starting to take a psychological toll. They had sought answers, but now it seemed they had stumbled upon something much larger, something they didn't understand. As the night wore on, the unease in the room grew. What started as an experiment rooted in science was beginning to feel like a journey into the inexplicable. And though no one said it aloud, the same thought lingered in every mind. Were they observing the unknown, or was the unknown observing them? By the 16th hour, the tension in the lab had escalated to unbearable levels. The whispers hadn't returned, but the memory of them lingered in the air, leaving an invisible weight on everyone present. The camera feed remained steady, showing Robert's still form in the coffin, yet something about the image felt different. The burial shroud seemed slightly looser, almost as if it had been disturbed further. Then, without warning, the camera feed flickered again. When it stabilized, the scientists noticed a faint shadow moving in the corner of the coffin's interior. It was subtle, like a trick of the light, but undeniably there. Dr. Carter froze, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the screen. "Enhance the feed," she instructed, her voice sharper than before. A technician adjusted the settings, amplifying the image. The shadow grew clearer, not an object but a distortion, as though the air inside the coffin itself was shifting unnaturally. "That's not a malfunction," Dr. Carter murmured. "Something is—" She stopped herself, unable to find the right words. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the team in stunned silence. But the silence didn't last long. Moments later, a distinct sound emanated from the speakers. It wasn't a tap or a scrape this time, but a series of knocks, loud, deliberate, and rhythmic. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. The pattern was unmistakable. "It's communication," one of the scientists whispered, the words trembling out of their mouth. "Don't jump to conclusions," Dr. Carter said, though even she seemed rattled. Her logical mind searched for an explanation, but the situation was growing increasingly inexplicable. The knocks stopped, replaced by an unnerving groan, low and guttural, like wood bending under pressure. The camera feed remained visually unchanged, yet the sound suggested movement, pressure, life. The scientists exchanged nervous glances, their minds struggling to process the implications. And then it happened. The shroud moved again, this time more visibly, as if being pulled downward. A collective gasp filled the room. The audio feed picked up a faint creaking sound, followed by what could only be described as a muffled exhale. It was as though the very air inside the coffin was alive, reacting. Dr. Carter finally broke the silence. "Log everything. We need to track every second of this. We're seeing something unprecedented." Despite her composed tone, the fear in her eyes betrayed her. The team had set out to document a mystery, but it was becoming clear that this mystery was far more complex, and perhaps far more dangerous, than they could have ever anticipated. At the 20th hour, the unease in the lab became almost unbearable. The camera feed remained clear, showing Robert's lifeless form, but the team couldn't shake the sense that something unseen was present. The audio feed continued to capture faint, intermittent sounds, soft creaks, subtle shifts, and occasional muffled noises that defied explanation. Each noise felt intentional, as though something within the coffin was responding to their presence. Then, just as the team began to settle into a tense silence, the camera feed flickered violently. For a split second, the screen went black. When the image returned, the team collectively froze. The burial shroud had shifted dramatically, now bunched at Robert's feet, revealing his face. His features, though still and lifeless, seemed different, almost as if they were reacting to some unseen force. "What's happening?" a technician stammered, their voice breaking. Before anyone could respond, the speakers emitted a loud, distorted sound. It wasn't static or interference. It was a voice. Faint and garbled, but unmistakable, it spoke a single, chilling word. "Why?" The room erupted into chaos. Scientists scrambled to analyze the audio, replaying the clip over and over. The voice was faint but clear, and it didn't match Robert's recorded voice prints. "This isn't possible," one of the technicians muttered, their hands trembling as they worked the controls. "The coffin is sealed. There's no external input." Dr. Carter remained silent, her eyes fixed on the screen. The voice had sounded almost pleading, as though it carried an emotional weight that transcended logic. "Play it again," she ordered, her tone firm despite the unease gripping her. The word repeated, the distortion slightly clearer with each replay. "Is it him?" someone asked hesitantly, though no one dared answer. As they debated, the camera captured another unsettling change. Robert's hands, which had been resting peacefully on his chest, were now positioned at his sides. The movement had been subtle but undeniable, as though they had shifted during the blackout. "Rewind the footage," Dr. Carter commanded. The team complied, but there was no record of the hands moving. One frame showed them crossed, the next, they were at his sides. It was as though the transition had happened in an instant, bypassing the camera's ability to capture it. The lab fell into an uneasy silence. Dr. Carter took a deep breath and addressed the team. "We're witnessing something that challenges everything we understand. This isn't just an anomaly, it's a phenomenon. Document every second. No assumptions, no distractions." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her mind. The experiment had been meant to answer questions, not create them. And now it felt as though the answers were slipping further away, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The scientists were no longer merely observers. They had become participants in a mystery that seemed intent on revealing itself in ways they were unprepared to face. As the 24th hour approached, the atmosphere in the lab became suffocating. Exhaustion mixed with dread as the team continued to monitor the feed. Every sound, every flicker of movement carried an unspoken question. What were they witnessing? The camera feed remained steady, showing Robert's still form, but the burial shroud at his feet appeared to be stirring faintly, as if moved by a non-existent breeze. Then came a sound that shattered the fragile composure of the room, a loud, deliberate knock followed by another and another. It echoed clearly through the speakers, resonating with a rhythm too precise to be dismissed as coincidence. The scientists stared at the monitor, their faces pale with disbelief. Dr. Carter leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the console. "That's a signal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could respond, the camera feed flickered again. This time the distortion lingered, and when the image returned, something had changed. The interior of the coffin seemed darker, almost as if the shadows were deepening unnaturally. But what truly sent a wave of panic through the room was the appearance of faint, almost imperceptible marks on the coffin lid. Scratches etched into the wood from the inside. The lab fell silent as the team tried to process what they were seeing. "Rewind the footage," Dr. Carter ordered. They did, but the marks hadn't been there before. They had appeared within the brief seconds of the flicker. "Are we sure this isn't interference?" one of the technicians asked, though the question sounded more like a plea. Dr. Carter shook her head, her face grim. "Interference doesn't leave physical evidence," she replied. Her words hung heavy in the air, amplifying the growing unease. As the team debated, the audio feed picked up something new, a faint rhythmic breathing. It was so subtle that at first they thought it might be their own imaginations. But as the sound grew louder, it became unmistakable. The breathing was uneven, labored, as though coming from someone or something in distress. "That's impossible," another scientist muttered, his hands shaking as he adjusted the audio levels. "He's not breathing. He can't be breathing." Dr. Carter stood, her gaze locked on the screen. "Whatever this is," she said, her voice firm but tinged with apprehension, "it's not following the rules we understand, but we have to keep going." The team's focus returned to the screen, and for a moment, everything seemed to settle. The breathing stopped and the camera feed stabilized. But just as they began to think the worst had passed, the coffin lid appeared to bulge upward slightly, as though something inside was pressing against it. Gasps filled the lab, and Dr. Carter's voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone, stay focused. We document, we don't speculate." The bulge receded, leaving the coffin's interior unchanged, but the damage to the team's nerves had been done. They were no longer just recording an experiment. They were witnessing something that defied explanation, and the realization sent a ripple of fear through the room. Despite the growing unease, Dr. Carter knew one thing for certain. They had crossed a threshold, and whatever lay beyond it wasn't finished revealing itself. The 28th hour marked a turning point in the experiment. The lab was silent save for the steady hum of the equipment and the occasional murmur from the scientists. The team had stopped trying to rationalize the events. They had no explanations, only theories that seemed more outlandish with each passing moment. Dr. Carter sat at the helm, her gaze unwavering, though the tension in her body betrayed her calm demeanor. Suddenly the camera feed flickered once more, and the coffin's interior was bathed in an eerie green glow. This time, when the image returned, the scene was undeniably altered. The burial shroud was no longer at Robert's feet, but folded neatly to the side, as though someone had deliberately moved it. More alarming, Robert's face was turned slightly to the side, his expression serene, but distinctly different from before. "What is this?" a technician whispered, his voice trembling. Did he move?" Before anyone could respond, the audio feed crackled with static, followed by a faint, melodic humming. The sound was soft, almost soothing, yet deeply unsettling given the circumstances. It didn't match Robert's voice or anything they had recorded previously. It seemed to emanate from nowhere, filling the room with an unexplainable presence. Dr. Carter rose from her seat, her hands trembling slightly. "Isolate that sound," she ordered, her voice steady despite the growing fear in the room. The technicians worked quickly, amplifying the audio. The humming became clearer, taking on the cadence of a lullaby. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet utterly foreign. Then, without warning, the humming stopped and a voice broke through the speakers, clear, calm, and unmistakably Robert's. "Thank you," it said simply. The room froze. Every eye was on the monitor, every breath held. The words were soft but filled with an emotion that sent chills through the team. "Thank you," the voice repeated, this time stronger, more distinct. Dr. Carter stared at the screen, her mind racing. He's communicating," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. "Document everything, every second." As the team scrambled to record the data, the camera feed flickered one final time. When the image returned, the coffin was empty. Robert's body was gone. The burial shroud lay undisturbed, but there was no sign of the man who had been there moments before. Panic erupted in the lab. "This isn't possible," one scientist shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "We saw him. He was there." Dr. Carter didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen, searching for an explanation, but none came. "Rewind the footage," she commanded. The technicians complied, but the replay revealed nothing. One frame showed Robert's body, the next it was gone, as though he had vanished into thin air. As the team grappled with the implications, the audio feed crackled again, and Robert's voice returned, softer this time. "It's okay," he said. "I'm free now." The words lingered in the air, heavy with finality. The feed went dark, and no amount of troubleshooting could restore it. The experiment had ended, leaving the team with more questions than answers. Dr. Carter sat in silence, her mind replaying Robert's final words. She had sought to uncover the truth about life and death, but what she found was something far more profound. A mystery that could never be fully explained, only experienced. In the days that followed, the footage was reviewed repeatedly, but no scientific analysis could account for what had happened. The experiment was quietly shelved, the data locked away, and the team disbanded. For Dr. Carter, the experience left an indelible mark. She had set out to push the boundaries of human understanding, but in doing so, she had glimpsed something beyond comprehension. Sometimes the answers we seek are not meant to be found, and sometimes the unknown offers its own kind of closure.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.